I'm delighted to be here this evening and thrilled to be linked in some small way to such a stunning exhibition. It's been about a year and a half since we were last in France, so for me, seeing the paintings was something of a reconnection. I should explain that for the last 7 months, we've been travelling around Australia. And our daily reality has been things like caravan parks and campfires and long car trips and a fair amount of cask wine at the end of these long car trips. The landscapes we saw during these 7 months was very much the dry red earth, and the hills covered in spinifex, the blinding salt lakes. The monuments we saw came in the form of massive rock formations, and the sculptures were really the craft of termites. So for much of the last year, the world of Paris and European art and French culture may as well have been on another planet. This exhibition then brought back a rush of memories for me. When we lived in Paris, we would often on weekends take off. We had a motorbike then, and would take off and explore the countryside surrounding the city. And it struck me when I was looking at the paintings that some of those scenes have scarcely changed. Others, of course, have changed considerably with busy roads and buildings. But as I was looking at the exhibition, it struck me that they sang of France. They were immediately recognisable as scenes of the French countryside. And I think there are many factors to explain this, but one of them is the light, that lovely soft light. The colours, so different from even the sunset colours, were so different from the psychedelic sunsets we saw as we were travelling around Australia. Those spring meadows full of poppies and edged with poplars, the pale grey skies, winter skies, all these things for me were immediately evocative of France. And the word that sprang to mind as I was walking through looking at the paintings was a French word, la douceur, which roughly translates as a mixture between somewhere between softness and gentleness. And it was this quality in those landscapes that I think made them so evocative of France, so immediately evocative of France. Since I wrote my book, my life has changed quite considerably. One of the big changes is that I no longer live in Paris. We moved from the city about 5 years ago, first to settle in Tahiti, and more recently to live in to settle in Sydney. I think it's a good thing in a way. I'm not writing my book now. The distance has definitely made me more nostalgic and more sentimental, and I'm afraid that would probably cloud my objectivity. But I thought I'd indulge that nostalgia tonight a little bit and talk about some of the things that I think make Paris so special as a city. And one of those things is, I think, the blurring of art and life in the French capital. In Australia, if you want to go and see art, it requires a decision, an effort, an outing. In Paris, if you want to go and see art, you really just need to go and buy a baguette. I used to say that walking out my front door in Paris felt like stepping onto a stage. Almost immediately, you're amid architectural grandeur and the legacy of ambitious kings and emperors. And it made even mundane sort of excursions or chores quite uplifting. I think the other special thing about the beauty of Paris is that it's just not this grand scale beauty. It's not just about monuments and magnificence. It's also beauty on a small scale. It probably sounds silly, but I used to feel quite moved just walking past the window of a chocolate shop and looking at the handmade chocolates and the care that went into making them. Each one is sort of a mini work of art in its own right. Or just walking past a very intricately sculpted wooden doorway. So I think it's those two things. I think it's Paris is not just about beauty on a grand scale, but also these details. And certainly it taught me, living in the city, taught me to look and observe my surroundings in a way that I hadn't done in my own country. I think this beauty can be problematic for writers and for filmmakers and for anyone who's using Paris as a backdrop in some ways. It's so pervasive and it's so much a part of living in the city and it's so inspiring. But how do you convey it without ending up with a collection of cliches? Paris is so much more than just the sum of postcard images. And yet I think we forget that when we... I think we often forget that, so much so that when the world saw those images of rioting on the outskirts of Paris and the car burnings that occurred, well, they occur regularly, but there was a really bad year a couple of years ago. And when people saw that, I don't think they could reconcile those violent images in some ways with their picture-perfect perceptions of Paris. It's obviously a living, breathing, evolving city. It's fantastic, but it's also flawed. And when I wrote my book, I wanted to convey all this. I really wanted to be honest. From the point of view of a foreigner I wanted to convey living as a foreigner in the city and that sense of trying to grapple with the culture and the differences. I guess it's that classic it's a bit the cliche of feeling French in Australia, but feeling very Australian in France, that a lot of people who love two countries know. But for a lot of my time in France, I felt a bit like a fly in the wall. And whilst that's a fascinating position to be in, it can also be a bit precarious and a little bit lonely at times. So I wanted to convey that, and I also wanted to convey that that Paris wasn't just about being a glorious stage. That's only one layer of the city. If the monuments and elegant buildings are synonymous with the French capital, then for me, so too is the sweaty claustrophobia of the city in summer, or the smell of pee in the metro tunnels that when you live there gets a bit after a while. But when I was living in Paris, for a lot of that time I was working as a freelance journalist, and so my life didn't seem very glamorous, but the very fact for people that I was living in Paris, of course, made it immediately glamorous. So I wanted to convey the idea that living in Paris was not just one long, lovely stroll in the Louvre. I guess I realised how spectacularly I'd failed at that. I mean, if my one of my aims in writing the book had been to dispel some myths, I realised that I'd failed spectacularly a couple of years ago when the Sydney Morning Herald published a poll, and people were asked, I think the question was, whose life you would most like to have, or whose life you most envied. And to my amazement and considerable embarrassment, my name was top of the list. Part of the explanation, I think, for this is the nature of memoir writing. My book was a travel memoir. And when you're trying to condense several years of experience into several hundred pages, invariably you strip away those mundane and dull aspects that are part of life anywhere. And what you can end up with is a sort of heightened reality in which even the painful, punishing moments have a sort of exotic charm, which they certainly didn't have at the time. I think the other conclusion that we could draw from the poll, the other thing I realised, if I ever needed a reminder of it, was simply the enduring fascination with all things French, the power of Paris. I think if I'd written a book called Almost Lithuanian about the very lovely city of Vilnius, it would never have had the same broad appeal. The image of Paris as the eternal seductress is a terrible cliche, and I cringe in saying it, but I think, like a lot of cliches, there's more than a grain of truth to it. Although Paris is famously home to Monet's Water Lily series, there's one Monet painting in particular that resonates with me. In fact, when I was writing my book, I became very obsessed with this painting. It's a depiction of a Paris street and called Rue Montorgueil. It took me about 3 years to learn how to say that, but I got a lot of practice because we lived there. It was the Market Street, just around the corner from where we lived, and it was lined with food shops. It still is lined with food shops that open their stalls and set up a sort of market street on some days of the week. I stumbled across this painting first in a book when I was actually researching my book and writing about the history of the neighbourhood, our neighbourhood, and I was thrilled to learn that Monet had painted it. He painted the street on the 30th of June 1878, I think it was. It was a day of great celebrations in Paris to mark the end of the World Fair. And the street was full of joyful, jostling crowds and French flags and a general sort of very party atmosphere. I think I'm right in saying that the painting was a bit different for Monet in the sense that he was working really as a reporter. He was recording events, not just as an artist. Also because the theme was so very, very modern, particularly for the time. It was very Republican, very political, and quite modern. I wasted no time in going to the Musée d'Orsay to see this painting, but to my great disappointment, there was in place of the painting, there was a little plaque saying that the painting that Rue Montorgueil was on loan to galleries in Japan and wouldn't be back for many, many months. I inquired further at the museum, and as it turned out, the painting was still at the museum, but it was packed up, ready to be flown away, and of course there was no way of seeing it. In fact, I was told that it was impossible, c'est impossible. It might sound odd, but it was upon hearing those words that I thought, I might get to see this. Anyone who's ever lived in France would know that c'est impossible is a kind of a stock standard response to almost any request. And it doesn't necessarily mean that it's impossible. It is sometimes an invitation for you to win over the person and to try and argue your case. I obviously did this with some success, because some days later I found myself being led down to the depths of the Musée d'Orsay, to the areas that are normally closed to the public, for a private viewing of this priceless painting. I have to say that after all that effort, my first thought when I saw this painting, that it had become really important in my mind. I'd become quite obsessed about it. It was critical to my book in some way that I couldn't explain. And when I saw it, my first thought was, oh my God, what a mess. I know Monet is not renowned for his detail, but this painting seemed to me utterly chaotic. It was a frenetic jumble of colour, mainly of red, white and blue because of all the French flags waving on the street that day, and brush strokes. And it looked as though finishing it had been some sort of a race. Obviously, as everyone knows, it's only in stepping back from a Monet sometimes that you get some perspective on it. And I remember that moment as quite magical, that moment of the mess turning into a kind of a masterpiece, a very so recognisably my street as I thought of it, was really quite memorable for me. While Rue Montagueil is still the same canyon-like street that Monet captured so beautifully, and it sort of carves between the buildings very narrowly, it has changed quite considerably, as I realised on my last visit to France, which was, as I said, about a year and a half ago now. I was mortified to see there was a Starbucks at the top of the street and to see that there were many more kind of takeaways, all kinds of takeaways on the street, that it had lost and it was losing some of that sort of quintessential market atmosphere that it had had for so long. The changes that had already started before we left, and I certainly write about them in my book, but it's gone one step. I think Starbucks definitely takes it one step further. Mostly, though, what struck me when I was back in Paris was that the city had seemed to me to have changed for the better. I think it's always been considered a great city, obviously, but that greatness is cyclical. When I first arrived in Paris, it was 1995, and it was at a time when everyone was talking about la morosité, the morosity, and all the French papers were talking about la malaise française. To make matters worse, there were really unfavourable comparisons with London, which I think were very hard for the French to swallow. London was hip and happening. It even had good restaurants. Some said its restaurants were better than those in Paris. And Paris, in comparison, was seen as some kind of museum, a very glorious museum, but nonetheless a bit dead. I had a strange feeling at that time of being in the wrong city at the wrong time. But what a difference a few years make. London, I suppose, has lost some of that upbeat feeling right now. And whilst Paris has certainly been hit, from talking to friends, by the financial crisis, I think generally over the last, say, decade, there's been a real injection of imagination and energy. It's difficult to pinpoint. It's not just one person. There are many factors. But for me, one of the a great contributor has been the mayor, the current French Paris mayor, Bertrand Delanoë, who was voted in, I think, in 2001. And he's got a real vision for the city. He's injected a lot of life into it. He's confronted that old, the image of it being a bit of a museum, and he wants to make the city playful, a kind of an eco-friendly city, which is as much for Parisians as it is for tourists. Other people might also say there's been a roll-on effect with the new president, Nicolas Sarkozy, and that somehow he's injected some life into the French capital. He's really another talk unto himself. I think he's a fascinating character. And he's very controversial, he's very divisive. But love him or hate him, as the French do, passionately, I think the one thing you could never accuse hyperactive Sarko, as he's called, of being is, or of lacking, is energy. I was going to finish this talk on on Monet, and the idea that I always felt when I was in Paris that Monet was a kind of presence, which is very true. But on the way here, and it's in a presence, beyond the fact that his water lilies are there and you see the queues of people constantly lining up to see those iconic paintings. I mean, that's a reminder, obviously, but in other ways, more subtle ways, more fundamental ways, perhaps, I always felt Monet was a presence. On the way here, though, it occurred to me that it's more than that. He's omnipresent. That his legacy goes so much beyond the paintings that he left us. I think that Monet taught us a different way of seeing. He taught us really to look. He taught us to see, to look at patterns of light and shade, to think what colours they really are, what colours we would use for those shadows. And I think he taught us also to, quite simply, to squint, not only at his own paintings, but also at the world around us. And it struck me on the way here that while we were travelling around Australia, we did this a lot. We didn't consciously think of Monet and the Impressionists necessarily, but as we looked at these landscapes that were so utterly different from anything they had painted, I think they were there in the back of our minds somewhere. So thank you for being such lovely listeners.